This video is brought to you by TLDR Business. The war in Ukraine has reinvigorated Europe's interest in security and defence. Basically, every large European country has pledged to increase defence spending to at least 2% of GDP, as recommended by NATO, and the so-called peace dividend, which refers to the money that unthreatened states can redirect away from defence towards other stuff like healthcare and education, has basically evaporated. So in this video, we thought we'd take the chance to compare the various European militaries and do our best to figure out who has the most powerful military in Europe at the moment, and how that might change in the future. As things stand, it's basically a two-horse race for the most powerful European army between Europe's two nuclear-armed powers, the UK and France. According to Global Firepower's annual military strength rating, which essentially compares the number of vehicles and personnel to compare the relative power of different militaries, in 2022 France had the world's 7th most powerful military, while the UK has the 8th. Next on the list is Italy, which has the 11th most powerful, and then it's Germany in 16th, Spain in 19th, Ukraine in 22nd, although that probably needs updating, and Poland in 24th. France ekes out the UK as Europe's most powerful army according to Global Firepower because, despite reliably spending more money on defence than the French, the Brits just have less stuff. Now, we should say here that the number of personnel or vehicles isn't a perfect metric for an army's actual effectiveness, but it's not completely unrelated, and the French just have both more personnel and more vehicles. While the UK has slightly more reservists than the French has 205,000 active personnel, 11,000 more than the UK. The French also have significantly more aircraft than the UK, more tanks, more armoured vehicles, and even more ships. Now, given that France has a lower budget than the UK but loads of kit, you might assume that these vehicles are cheap and therefore subpar. However, that's not actually the case. France is currently in the middle of the 20-year modernisation programme called Project Scorpion, which has significantly improved the capabilities of their hardware, and especially their land forces. Launched with $6.5 billion of funding over 11 years in 2014, Scorpion aims to replace almost all frontline armoured vehicles in the French army. In practice, this will involve the production and procurement of something like 4,500 armoured vehicles, and the renovation of about 200 French Leclerc tanks. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail here because it'll just sound like a load of confusing acronyms for anyone who isn't an army nerd. But the main thing you need to know is that these vehicles, and especially the Griffon VBMR, which is going to make up nearly half of the new vehicles, are some of the best available. The other thing that's particularly impressive about the Scorpion programme is that, unlike basically every other military procurement programme ever, it's currently on schedule and on budget. According to analysts, this is largely because most of the work is being done by a single consortium of French companies, including Nexter, Texelis, Thales and Arcus. This is continuous with Macron's vision of European strategic autonomy, which involves reducing Europe's reliance on America and therefore American arms manufacturers. The programme has been such a success that in 2017 Belgium joined in and is now buying new armoured vehicles from the same consortium of French companies. Now, this doesn't mean that France's military is definitely better than the UK's. Comparing militaries is difficult because, well, different militaries aspire to do different things. And while the Scorpion programme might have significantly improved French land-based capabilities, some analysts think that the UK has a better navy and air force. Anyway, whatever the case, the main takeaway here is that the UK and France have the two most powerful armies in Europe. So how might this change in the future? Well, as we see it, there are two countries that could challenge this Anglo-French duopoly in the future, and that's Germany and Poland. Let's start with Germany. Since the early 2000s, Germany has spent significantly less than its European counterparts on defence, despite having the largest economy on the continent. Expressed as a percentage of GDP, the difference becomes even more stark. Germany averaged about 1.2% of GDP on defence compared to about 2.2% for the UK and 1.9% for France, well below NATO's recommended 2% target. This was, in part, a reflection of Merkel's dovish foreign policy and her general preference for cooperation over confrontation. Underinvestment left the Bundeswehr relatively toothless, something senior German officials have been warning about for years. Inspector of the Army Lieutenant General Alfons Mays, the highest-ranking officer in the German army, warned in 2020 that not a single brigade-sized unit in the German army was actually deployable, and, in the days after the invasion, described the German army as bare. However, this is all set to change in the coming years. In reaction to Putin's invasion, Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a so-called Zeitenwende, which essentially involves increasing Germany's military budget to 2% of GDP in the next couple of years via a one-off $100 billion extra budgetary procurement fund, known as the Sondervermögen, which is supposed to be spent within the next 3 years. Scholz has since said that he expects the Sondervermögen to turn Germany into, quote, the best equipped armed force and the cornerstone of conventional defence in Europe. So what's this money going to be spent on? Well, if reports are to be believed, most of it's going to be spent on the Bundeswehr's air force. Germany plans on buying 35 of the latest F-35s, a hugely expensive stealth aircraft made by US contractor Lockheed Martin, and several more anti-submarine and surveillance aircraft. Interestingly, Germany is planning to spend nearly a quarter of the entire Sondervermögen on cyber and new communications technology, which will mean Germany should have one of the most technologically advanced militaries in Europe by 2025. Now, the Sondervermögen alone probably isn't enough to turn Germany into Europe's largest military, and it really depends on whether they continue to invest in defence after 2025. Nonetheless, it's at least true to say that the Germans are taking their security more seriously than at any time in the past quarter century, and they're one to keep an eye on. The other country to keep an eye on is Poland. Unlike Germany, Poland has reliably spent about 2% of GDP on defence and is on track to spend 2.4% of GDP this year. If this wasn't enough, Warsaw has since said it will raise its target defence spending to 5%, which would make it by far and away the biggest spender in NATO as measured as a share of GDP. Most of this will be spent on Poland's land forces and army, which makes sense given Poland's geography. The Polish Defence Minister pledged in July that his country would have the most powerful land forces in Europe. Poland already has more tanks, artillery and mobile rocket launchers than both France and the UK, and a similar number of armoured vehicles. On top of that, the Poles want to have 300,000 troops in their army by 2035, which would make them the largest force in Europe. Now, while this would make Poland one of the most powerful militaries in Europe, it's not clear that they can actually afford it. 5% of GDP is a lot, and Poland is already having to borrow quite a lot of money to afford its current expenditure. Nonetheless, if they can find the money, Poland will probably become one of the most powerful land-based forces in Europe. Anyway, if you're more interested in economics than military stuff, then check out our new channel TLDR Business. There we unpack all kinds of business stories, like the ongoing drama with Twitter and Musk threatening Apple, why everyone hates Ticketmaster, and why everyone's getting fired in big tech at the moment. If that sounds good, then click the link to the TLDR Business channel in the description and subscribe for more.